Well, in Canada, we call today, November 11th, Remembrance Day. And in the US, you call it Veterans Day. And I just found out that in the US, you also have Memorial Day, which I always knew, but I didn't know what it was for. So I just found out. So Veterans Day, you apparently celebrate the US veterans and what they did. And Memorial Day, you celebrate all veterans in all wars. So I think this is very good, actually. I think that Canada should have more days to remember what veterans have done. And in Canada, it's a very big deal. So I went and took a look at the front page of some newspapers today, and on the New York Times, there is absolutely no mention of Veterans Day. Like, it's not a topic. But I looked at some major newspapers in Canada, and it's on the front page of every newspaper, and there are Remembrance Day celebrations happening in every city. It's a big deal in schools. It's a big deal. And so I grew up with this being a big deal. And I think as spiritual practitioners, it's a fantastic opportunity to really reflect on what people have sacrificed in the past and to the present day, so that we can enjoy peace and security. And I remember my first introduction to Remembrance Day was as a very young kid lying in bed in the morning, and down the streets of our town, this little motley band of musicians would go through the streets playing, not very well, World War II songs. And these were, some of them were veterans. For a while it was my dad, who was not a veteran, but he knew how to play the trumpet, so they weren't going to get anybody. And this is the first thing that people in our town heard. This would be about 4 in the morning. And then I later came to learn that these musicians would end up at the local Canadian Legion, which is an establishment where veterans go to gather and then actually drink alcohol. And this is how veterans actually dealt with the pain that they came home with. It was really the only solution they had. And then once I entered school, there was an assembly and a gathering for each Remembrance Day, and it was a huge deal. And I think all of us kids really got that this was serious. It was something that we had to try and wrap our minds around, and the adults around us were trying so hard to sort of convey the message of this day. And then later on as a teacher, I found I was in the same position of trying to make sense of this for kids so that they could start to see the value of what we have. You know, in Buddhist terms, we'd call it the 10 freedoms and fortunes, really. But it's always been a big deal. So World War II, as I was growing up, was just really not, I didn't really understand it. And one of the reasons for that is that my family, just out of karmic luck, I guess, they were either too young or too old to be conscripted into the army. So my immediate family members, my grandparents, my great-grandparents didn't go. And so, of course, growing up in Canada, once I was old enough to remember watching television and remembering what I watched, the Vietnam War was on. And so that was my introduction to, you know, war in the present age. And I remember at one point, I was about 10 years old, and I just remember clearly this moment of standing in our family bathroom, putting towels down the laundry chute, and just thinking to myself, I wonder if the Vietnam War will ever end. And how could we possibly not have learned our lesson from World War II? Now that was a 10-year-old mind thinking. And of course I didn't know anything about, you know, how one avoids creating the circumstances or the causes and conditions for war. But I just thought, you know, is it going to end? Is this just forever? And it made me feel quite sad as a kid. And then I went through high school. We didn't study World War II. The curriculum changed the year I was in grade 10, so we looked at Asia and Africa for 3 years. So I really missed a big opportunity there. And then for some reason I didn't have the interest to really research the war. So my understanding of war was just almost nil. And it wasn't until I went on a camping trip throughout Europe when I was 23 years old that I finally got the jolt that I needed. We went to 16 countries in 9 weeks. That was something else all on its own. But there were 2 stops on the trip that changed my perspective of what's important in life in a big way. And This one day we rolled into a place, and about an hour ahead, the tour guide said, oh, by the way, we're going to stop off at Dachau concentration camp. So, you know, there's a bunch of 20-year-olds on the bus. Most of the bus was hungover. A lot of the people were doing heavy drinking on this camping tour, and it was just like, okay, whatever. So the moment we started getting off the bus, we were in this very large parking lot, and the concentration camp was sort of looming about 300 feet away, and I was overwhelmed with this feeling of dread. There was this feeling in the air of death, you know, and this is decades later. And I just immediately got this sick feeling in my stomach, and I didn't really know what we were heading into. And so it's a very wonderful museum in that it shows graphically what happened to people when they ended up there. And this was a camp, it was one of the first camps actually. And it inspired all the other camps that were built in Poland and in Austria. And it was a camp eventually that specialized in torture and medical experiments. There are a number of pictures in the museum. The gas chambers were there. There were shoes of people that were, you know, left there who were murdered there. And I just came to know the horrific plan that had been going for years there. More than 200,000 people died at Dachau. And these were not just Jewish people. They were rounding up everyone who they considered to be a threat. Prisoners of war ended up there from all the countries. Intellectuals, people who were gay, university professors, artists, you name it. There was just a wide range of people who were rounded up and then executed there. And so when I saw this, at 23, I didn't know anything about Buddhism. I didn't have any tools to really work with my mind on what I was learning about, but it filled me with horror about what the human mind is capable of, and how can we possibly, as a human group, step away from this? And I had no answers to that at that time. About a week later, roughly, I don't remember now, we headed on and we were going through Austria, and then again, the guy in charge of the tour said, oh, by the way, we're going to stop off at Mauthausen today. So I didn't know anything about Mauthausen, so I thought, oh, okay. And then I find out it's another concentration camp, and I was just filled with fear. And so we get to the place, and again, the same thing happened, except now I had some information, and I knew the kind of atrocities that I was going to learn about, or some of them. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure, maybe fortunately, the museum was closed that day. There's different days in Europe where museums are simply closed. So we spent some time walking around the site. And what was especially sickening with this experience is that Mauthausen is placed in a very gorgeous place in Austria. And there is signage all over the place for visitors to read about what went on there. And this was a camp that was designed to work people to death. There was a granite quarry there. People were given hardly any tools, and the idea was that you used your bare hands. And again, this is like a model camp for many others of working people to death. And at one place, there was a horrific thing to see and to think about. It was called the Stairway to Death, or the Stairway to Hell, something like this. I think I have it written down here somewhere. Anyway, to make a long story very short, people would be loaded up with granite on their backs, and they'd be forced to run, if they could, up this steep set of stairs. And usually the load was too heavy, so people would fall down, and they would crush the people behind them, and bones would be broken, or people would die. And then the guards would haul these people back up to their feet and force them to the top. And if they were still alive when they made it to the top, then it was called the parachute jump. And they were either forced to push the person in front of them over the cliff, so they'd plunge to their death, or someone would be standing there with a gun pointed to their head, and then you'd have to jump. So it was either be shot in the head or jump. So I don't know who chose what. But anyway, this is one of the many examples of how that camp was geared for torture. Some of the other things that were done there was, and I think it's important for our meditations to know these details. It gets quite difficult to read these and think about these. But, you know, if we ever run out of things to purify in our practice, I think for the rest of my life I'm going to take my mind back to these, because as we know, we've been here since beginningless time. And for sure, I've committed some of these things in the past, and I do not want to ever engage in these in the future. So for example, they would give these people at this camp icy showers. And then they'd leave them out in the cold where they'd freeze to death. There would be mass shootings. This typically occurred at sundown. There were medical experiments going on at this camp as well. And it was at this camp there was this fellow by the name of Albert Heim. He was called the Doctor of Death. And he would carry out his experiments there. They would inject people with cholera and typhus just to see how people would react to those things. They would hang people. They would starve them to death. They would inject people with something called phenol. I'm not sure what action that would bring about. They would drown people in large barrels of water. They would beat people to death. There was one example where they'd make people stand on stools and they would tie their arms behind their head and they'd kick the stool away so that, you know, their arms and shoulders would break. They would throw prisoners on electrical barbed wire fence. They would force prisoners to go out of the boundary so that then the prisoners would run for it, and then they would shoot them in the back. And then they'd give the example that they were trying to escape. I had no idea that the human mind could come up with these kinds of things at age 23. And it still absolutely boggles my mind. And so when I think about the reasons why people were conscripted to go into war for World War I and World War II, you know, there was no other way to stop this kind of madness. Peace marches in the major cities of the world would not have stopped this kind of insanity. It would have it needed brute force to stop this kind of insanity. And so many people that I got to know as a teenager and then in my 20s and 30s who chose to go to war, they told me that they said they had this sense of responsibility. And they often said to themselves, well, if I don't do it, who will? And that drove them into, you know, volunteering to go to war. And so I think as practitioners, we can, in our meditations, just really, this is getting a bit hard. There's many ways to go at this topic. I think the one thing that was so striking to me was at Mauthausen. They didn't list all the names of the people that were murdered there because at that time, when I was there just wasn't the signage around, but they listed the people who were there who fought in the area, who were close by, and there were all these soldiers from all the countries in the world who were 16, 17, 18, you know, kids who joined the war. And I think just to make prayers for people who in many cases, they chose to join the military out of this responsibility, but many of these kids, I think, just thought, well, it's an adventure, and they had no idea what they were headed into. Absolutely none. And I think the people who even chose to go had no idea of the atrocities that they were going to encounter. So for all these people who endured such suffering and saw such horrific things, and for the people who came back even, just to make prayers that everyone engaged in every aspect of war, that their virtue from what they did just fully ripen in future lifetimes so that they never have that experience again. And for the perpetrators who did these horrific things, may they also, you know, whatever virtue they created in past lives, may that virtue that they've created fully ripen so that they get out of the hell realms where they surely went after all of this. And for all the people who lost loved ones at that time, and for the people who are still losing loved ones, because as you know, we still are a planet that has people going to war, that the families have some way of dealing with the grief that what I've read is just heartbreaking. You know, to lose anyone that you know in an act of violence that occurs in a war is just, it's really something very big. So, in closing, I think this kind of refresher that Veterans Day or Remembrance Day or Memorial Day brings us, that we use it And really, this kind of reflection takes us out of our own grumpy mind. At least it does it for me. It really shows me what's important, and it gives me impetus to make use of the time that I have left, and to really purify all those things that I've done in the past and in past lives that are just looming, waiting to ripen. So, some things to think about on Remembrance Day.